So, if we're thinking what qualifies a group of young people to be considered a youth culture, the first thing is values, which you might not necessarily think of. If you think a culture is a group's distinctive way of life, this includes values, its customs, its art, its technology. Now, in many courses, I bring up Talcott Parsons, who was a very, very staunch functionalist. He was the very first sociologist to ever use the term youth culture. And when he did, he said that there's certain values that distinguish youth culture. He said that a youth culture is basically the opposite of adult society. If you think what an adult society is, what it values, what it believes in, this includes things like responsibility, delaying gratification, not always expected to be rewarded quickly, not always being concerned with your own self gratification and self satisfaction. So Parsons said youth culture is the opposite of this, that it values hedonism, which is the pursuit of pleasure, and that it values irresponsibility or putting off being an adult. So while adult society really puts a lot of emphasis and value on having a regular routine, for example, doing what you're supposed to do, doing what's expected of you and accepting that, Parsons said youth culture values the opposite. Now, just on the surface, I can see what he's saying, even looking at all adolescence overall. Because don't we as a society tend to view adolescence as a time for just that? A time to be kind of irresponsible and have fun and put off being a full-fledged adult. Now, Parsons himself said that this is kind of like a rite of passage in Western societies because it really has become the norm before a young person marries and becomes an adult. Now, since the age of first marriage in Canada and the US has risen so much since the time Parsons was writing, this also means that the amount of time youth have to be this way is now extended. So part of what constitutes a youth culture is values, and another part is style. This not only it's not only values that distinguish youth culture, it's style. Now, you might not think much of the current youth style. You might think it's silly or even horrible, but it's still their style. And it was a British psychologist named Michael Brake who identified three key components of style. So he said that in terms of style, there's three essential components to style for youth. And I don't think you'll find any of these surprising, although you might not necessarily recognize all of them as actually being part of a culture. And the first part of style, he said, was image. How you dress, your hairstyle, jewelry, anything to do with your appearance. So for example, male hippies in the 60s with long hair, or punk rockers with mohawks, goth kids wearing all black, grunge kids dressing that way, hippies wearing bell bottoms, girls wearing poodle skirts in the 50s. So anything to do essentially with appearance comprises image, which is a part of style. Another aspect of the style of youth culture is demeanor, how they act. This means how they act, how they walk, maybe particular gestures, how they carry themselves. This is all part of a youth culture's style. Maybe they have a certain way of shaking hands or behaviors that they identify with, like skipping school to fit in as part of the group. Behaviors may also include going to certain places or completely avoiding certain places. It may mean that in the cafeteria, you only sit in a certain area, or in the library, you only sit in a certain area. The whole point of demeanor as an aspect of the style of youth culture is to conform to the expectations of the group as a whole. And Michael Brake also included as part of a youth culture's style how they spoke, which is academically referred to as argot, which I know is an odd word. It's a certain vocabulary and a certain way of speaking. We would refer to this as slang, informal vocabulary and grammar that is different from that of the native language. Sounds all official. This is one more way that young people reinforce that separateness, that how they differentiate themselves from adult society, to indicate that their culture is not the same as adult society. Now, a lot of slang has existed for decades, and sometimes slang words actually work their way into the dominant vocabulary, so you don't realize that it's actually slang. Some words just seem to come out of nowhere. For example, I still remember when the word sick first became popular. Um, Now, if you say, oh, that's totally sick, that means that's really cool. But it used to just mean somebody was ill. If something is lit, that means it's really cool. If it's dope, then that means it's cool. Feel free to laugh at my examples. Um, Even the word cool is slang to refer to something desirable. So looking at the style of a youth culture, their image, demeanor, and argot, this symbolizes certain values and beliefs that they feel distinguishes them from adult society. If we just look at the way they dress, for example, we don't even need to look at extreme examples. Dressing in jeans with a lot of tears in them, for example, is not something adults typically do. At this point, for girls anywhere, anyways, it seems like some jeans that are more torn than whole. So it's almost like there's barely anything keeping their jeans together. Now, adults might wear jeans with a few rips, but not as many, and they're not worn with the same purpose. When an adult wears jeans with a rip in them, that's from wearing them so much they're getting worn out, but they're still serviceable. But when youth do it, it's a fashion statement. They want to wear jeans with rips in them, not jeans that are whole. It's a purposeful choice. From an academic point of view, this is an example of open resistance to the more formal dress requirements of adult society. So it's done to signal that the person wearing them is not an adult and they're not the same as an adult. If we look at language, slang, to me, this is a really obvious example of how language to youth is a symbol of their values and beliefs. And again, it's something that they do to purposely demonstrate how separate they are from adult society. Going way back to the 80s, for a little while, there was a Valley Girl youth culture that emerged. And it was really, really, really well known for its slang. Saying like all the time, that's when that started. Or, oh my God, or gave me with a spoon, or that's totally tubular. This is also a good example of how slang was used to indicate a person's identity. Now, in retrospect, it sounds funny, doesn't it? It sounds really silly. But what this vocabulary did was act as a symbol of that young person's membership with a particular group, not with adult society. So what we can say then, to bring all of these points together, the purpose of a youth culture having its own style is that it signifies their separateness, the boundary between them and adults. It's a sign that they're not adults and don't want to be adults. But again, okay, so we know when the first youth culture developed and why it developed for the first time when it did. But why do these develop to begin with? Well, there's a few necessary conditions for a youth culture to emerge. And if these conditions aren't present, then it's not going to happen. One is that you have to be in a pluralistic society, meaning that there's a high degree of variability in socialization. I mean, think about it. If the norm in a society is narrow socialization, so that people have very little choice regarding how they live, how they're raised, how they're socialized, that means people are going to be expected to conform to a very high degree. They won't have the freedom to demonstrate different behaviors or different styles or slang or different group behavior. So in a really narrow, rigid society, a youth culture is simply not possible. That's just a fact, because the very structure of society doesn't allow for it. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be any teens at all trying to do their own thing, but it will be very few. And related to this is the idea that youth cultures have become common over the decades since the 20s, at least in part because of this increasing rise of individualism and the weakening of personal ties. which is much more straightforward than it sounds. If you ever take a course in sociological theory, I guarantee you'll spend some time studying Emile Durkheim. It's like law. And what he did was he rose about the rise of individualism. And all this means is, as society as a whole went from a mainly agricultural rural society to a mainly urban industrialized society, people began to define who they were more as individuals than defining themselves as individuals in relation to their community and their family so much. They became more individualistic, more focused on themselves. Very similar to the difference between individualistic and collectivistic societies. So this is the same kind of idea that in modern societies, it's possible for youth cultures to emerge because we not just focus on individualism, we encourage that focus. And because we encourage everybody to focus on being an individual, one of the side effects is having a personal ties that are not quite as strong. So in a more modern society, like the 1920s when it first happened, young people simply didn't feel the same sense of connectedness with their family and connectedness with their community in the same way people did in the past. And as a result of this, they don't feel the same sense of sameness, the same sense of solidarity with the dominant culture. So they have the freedom to express themselves in the way that they want as individuals. Now, Parsons made the point that when a youth culture does emerge, the people who participate in it are young people who have a certain amount of independence from their parents. So we're not talking primarily, 12 and 13-year-olds. We're talking about mid to the end of adolescence into emerging adulthood. And the time they take on responsibilities as an adult. So again, where young people have the freedom to develop their own culture and they can put off being an adult. Now, the guy who proposed the 3 aspects of style I just discussed, Michael Brake, he said that when a youth culture emerges, part of what it does, even though you might not realize it at the time, is that it helps young people figure out who they are, who they want to be, because they get to kind of experiment with different identities, which I think we could all agree it certainly does. So you're going to be a goth kid for a while, or I don't know what the current, I'm not familiar with current youth culture and past that. Or you're going to be really preppy for a while, or you're going to be a stoner for a while. You're going to try on these different identities. Now, Brake sees this not just as something that happens, he says this is actually needed, that young people need this space. They need space in terms of time and space in terms of their own culture to figure out who they are, to figure out their own identity, who they are apart from their family as their own person. So this time when they're not yet adults and they're not yet restricted by the demands of work and family and all that is really important. So while we as adults on the outside, we just see this mass of young people who all see the same, or at least very similar, being part of this collective identity, it actually has a very, very specific purpose. Now, I'm going to give you another example here because it's an example that I think most people are familiar with. Now, when people think of hippies, they tend to think of peace and love and a lot of drugs and tie-dye shirts and bell-bottoms and free love. And that certainly was part of it. The hippie subculture actually began as a youth movement in the US, a very liberal youth movement, comprised mostly of young people around 15 to 25. And hippies were actually in opposition to dominant society. They were in peaceful opposition, but it was still opposition. They really rebelled against dominant culture. They tried to actively influence the values and ways of life of dominant society to change and fall in line with their own perspective. They were in opposition to the Vietnam War, something they felt their country had absolutely no business being involved in, which fit with their focus on peace. They were against nuclear weapons, which fit with their value of peace. And they did also not like typical middle class values. They felt that they were too conservative. So hippies would refer to the dominant culture as the establishment and felt that it tried to exert too much control over society, that it was corrupt, that it really infringed on people's freedoms. They felt the government was becoming too involved in people's lives and that it was trying to control people too much. Now, what this group of people did openly support and embrace was sexual liberation of both men and women, which they considered a personal freedom. They were usually very eco-friendly in a time when this was not anywhere near as common as it is now with our blue boxes and energy conservation. Hippies were often vegetarians, and many of them practiced, at least in part, various Eastern religions or philosophies such as Buddhism or Taoism. Hippies truly believed in peace and love and personal freedom, not just in theory, but living one's life in that manner and encouraging the rest of society to follow suit. And they used folk music and street art and such to express their feelings and their perspective. So there was much more to hippie subculture than music, free love, and drugs, although they did promote the use of psychedelic drugs, believing these helped to expand your consciousness. So it's not uncommon for members of this subculture to establish their own communities. And it wasn't surprising that some considered hippies to be a kind of new religious movement, although it didn't identify as such. Now, in 1967, there were several things that occurred that really spread the hippie subculture and helped to familiarize all of the US with it, beginning with the Human Be-In in January of that year, 1967, in San Francisco. It attracted about 20 to 30,000 people. There was a Central Park Be-In in New York around Easter, when about 10,000 people attended. And then in June of 67 was the Monterey Pop Festival. That occurred, which really shone a spotlight for the entire country on the music of hippie culture. And they had people like the Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, and this was considered the start of the Summer of Love. Then the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album came out. And even the cover of it that you can see here indicates how heavily influenced they were by this subculture. And we're not even talking about the music yet. So if you listen to this album, some songs like Yellow Submarine are totally hippie music. And all of this continued to spread and build and spread and build. Again, really starting in 1967 and culminating in 1969 in Bethel, New York, with over 500,000 people attending the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, with people like Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Joan Baez, Jefferson Airplane, CCR, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Santana, and a whole list of others. Woodstock was so immensely successful and really did exemplify what the hippie culture was all about. Peaceful coexistence with everyone, freedom of personal expression. Look at this picture. You know, I've said to students before, you see these movies when people can magically travel around in time, and if you think about where would you like to go, I would go to Woodstock. So into the 70s, the hippie culture began to recede for several reasons. Some social, some political. Some might argue simply that societies are constantly evolving, they don't just stand still. And you could really take several courses studying this subculture because there is so much to it. But what using the hippie movement as an example does is it demonstrates how youth subcultures are often much, much more than simply a bunch of kids dressing the same and that's it. There's much, much more to them than a lot of people realize.